Wendy Steep and I, Jocelyn Paul, welcome you to Darcie Friesen Hossack's lecture on her novel Stillwater. Thank you for your loyalty to the virtual literary lecture series. Darcie Friesen Hossack is a talented and passionate writer, proud to be part of the pantheon of Mennonite authors that include Marion Tays, Rudy Wiebe, and Sandra Birdsall. Becoming a writer for Darcie wasn't so much a decision as a compulsion. Her short story collection, Mennonites Don't Dance, was published in 2010. It was shortlisted for 3 significant literary prizes: the Writers' Trust Anita Gleed Award, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Ontario Library Association's Evergreen Award for Adult Fiction. In 2023, Darcie's first novel, Stillwater, was published by Tidewater Press. Darcie has been a food columnist for the Kelowna Daily Courier, Kamloops The Week, and the Prairie Post. In the fall of 2020, during the pandemic, Darcie started the Word City Literary Journal. Emerging authors received their first publishing credits. Established writers wrote pieces addressing human rights disasters. Its last issue came out in October 2024, not for lack of success or the elimination of human rights violations, but for the sake of Darcie's health. Darcie was born in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. Her father is a Seventh-day Adventist, her mother a Mennonite. The couple separated when she was 2 and she stayed with her mother, taking the long train trip during school holidays to visit her father in Calgary. She has an older sister and a younger brother. Most weekends were spent at her grandparents' farm in Schönfield, Saskatchewan. And for Darcie, being a Mennonite is so much about food. It was at her grandmother's side that she learned to cook meals swimming in rich dairy products and animal fats, and create apple strudel smothered in whipped cream. And when she was 13, she chose to live with her father and became a Sabbath keeper, 7-day Adventist. They moved to Kelowna, where she attended the Okanagan Adventist Academy and met her future husband, Derek Hossack. They were married by his pastor father when she was 19. She enrolled in sociology and science courses at university to conform with the family's expectations to be practical, even though her teachers advised her to take writing courses. She dropped out after 2 years and took jobs in retail and as a receptionist to put her husband through chef school. As a child, Darcie read and wrote stories, but it would be several years before she turned to writing as a profession. She began as a freelancer and established herself as a food writer. Her columns featured stories accompanied by Mennonite recipes and photographs. Around 2004, Darcie began to compose the short stories which would become Mennonites Don't Dance. This reflection on her childhood renewed her faith in the Mennonite religion. Darcie confesses that being a Mennonite is so much about food that to eliminate it from her writing would undermine its authenticity. She bravely sent her stories to publishers and was dismayed by the number of rejections she received. One letter from a publishing house complimented Darcie on her writing ability and suggested that she find different content for her stories. I want to quote 2 lines from 2 short stories in Mennonites Don't Dance to emphasize her creative writing imagination. From Luna: he gently set down the pail, and the wire handles fell and chimed against the side. From poor Nella P: delicate cups dangle by their ears from small brass hooks. Darcie believes in writers reaching out to mentors. In 2005, out of desperation, she applied to the postgraduate mentorship program at Humber College for writing. She was paired with Sarah Birdsall, who restored her faith in her ability to write and taught her to eliminate the emotional baggage that was weighing down her stories. In 2010, when Mennonites Don't Dance was close to being published, Susan Musgrave was her editor. The Writers' Trust jury compared Darcie to Alistair MacLeod. She does not tell the reader how to feel about the characters. Instead, she describes their lives, and you find your heart opening up to them. Darcie wrote the first draft of Stillwater for the Sprint Marathon for National Novel Writing Month. Then she broke her back, and it was 5 years before she was able to sit at her desk to write. By then, the world had changed, and so had she. COVID had arrived, and the Seventh-day Adventists embraced the anti-vax movement. Darcie realized that this was an important thread in her narrative. Gail Anderson Dargatz mentored her as she wove her catastrophic injury and drug dependence into Stillwater. Darcie hopes that readers of Stillwater find solace in the characters that put love before faith. She hopes that more authors will take up the challenge of writing stories about the Seventh-day Adventist religion. She hopes that her lecture will give you an understanding of why the religious right supports the politics of Donald Trump. Thank you for being part of the virtual literary lecture series.
Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I'm Darcie Friesen Hossack, author of Stillwater and also Mennonites Don't Dance, along with a new novel, Remnants, a not yet available feminist dystopian set on the West Coast. I want to thank the Heliconian Club, Jocelyn Paul, and my publishers Lynn and Kilmeny at Tidewater Press for making this presentation possible. And I acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 6 territory in the Northern Rocky Mountains from the town of Hinton near Jasper, Alberta. This is going to be a bit of a different talk from the one I intended just a few months ago. Back in October and even December and January, I was preparing to tell you about the weirdness of growing up both Seventh-day Adventist and Mennonite. After all, Lizzie is my 16-year-old protagonist in Stillwater, and she and I both grew up with Seventh-day Adventist and Mennonite parents. And while I still plan to spend some of this time telling you how strange that was, and how personally dangerous it can be to be so culturally and spiritually isolated, I now also feel it is of pressing importance to link the kinds of characters you meet in Stillwater, like Daniel and Director Schlant, and even Marie, to the events taking place south of our border and here in Canada, especially in two of my home provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta. Unlike Lizzie, I grew up Mennonite in Saskatchewan with my mother's family until I was 13, and then Seventh-day Adventist with my father's family when I moved to Alberta and then British Columbia. In both Calgary and Kelowna, I attended Adventist academies, where I learned that vegetarianism, keeping the Sabbath and praying for the apocalypse, while not wearing jewelry and drinking tea or coffee, were closer to godliness than kindness, peace, and love for our neighbors. But then every few months, whenever the world didn't end as we were supposed to hope, we enjoyed another cultural touchstone, which was lining up in our academy or church parking lot to shop inside a traveling vegetarian food and bookstore that carried titles catering to, but never, ever challenging our very specific beliefs. So in the same place where we bought dehydrated textured soy chunks for stews and large rolls of ultra pink frozen Vegemite called Wham and canned beige nuggets in sauce called Fry Chick, we would also purchase church-approved books that reinforced what we already knew to believe, that the outside world was dangerous and out to get us. And both in Lizzie's experience of being taken to Stillwater and my experience of attending Adventist churches and private school, by the outside world, I mean you. I mean the CBC, I mean, television and movies and newspapers and kids from public school and coworkers and cashiers at the grocery store. I mean, other evangelicals, including Pentecostals and Baptists, and Mennonites, including my mother and the whole other side of my family, who, incidentally, felt the same way about everyone who wasn't them. And now, by the outside world, I also mean me, because I left the church, even if not my faith. So here I am in the outside world, writing subversive stories that don't end with an altar call. And here I am talking to you, multiplying that danger. For those of you who have already read Stillwater, you'll know that Lizzie and her younger brother Zach are both kind of calico sheep. Lizzie is an aspiring biologist who likes to dissect things she finds on the side of the road, and Zach is altogether too kind and has too many of the wrong kinds of qualities. In every way, they are both the wrong shapes to fit into the very specific, very square holes that have already been hollowed out for them to shape themselves into. And in fundamentalist, high control spaces like Stillwater, fitting in is the most important thing a member can do. People ask me whether Seventh-day Adventism is a cult. After all, it's unusual among other churches. We observe the Jewish Sabbath of Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. We have a 19th century American prophet, Ellen G. White, who taught us through a library of her books, much of the content of which she plagiarized, that there are aliens in our solar system, that vegetarianism is God's expectation, and that it wasn't a mistake for the first Adventist believers to sell off all of their property, then spend a night in a Michigan farmer's field waiting for the second coming, the date of which they decoded from various numbers in the Bible. And then, when Jesus didn't show up, it wasn't a mistake to revisit those numbers, double down, and do it again. Is Adventism a cult? I can't answer that because Adventists aren't a monolith, and many of their other beliefs can be found in the Christian mainstream. If, that is, by mainstream, we mean that women are taught to serve men who are designed to lead the family and the church and the government, even though our own so-called prophet was a woman. In Stillwater, Lizzie, Zach, and their mother Marie, for all purposes, belong to Daniel, who is Marie's husband and the children's father. He is their leader and their family priest, even though the trauma of his own childhood has rendered him emotionally and explosively unfit. Daniel is a kind, loving, toxic, dangerous man who needs extensive therapy and will never get it. Because the only help to be found for anyone in fundamentalism is through something called pastoral counseling, where abused children are taught to be grateful, where women are taught to be more obedient and to cook their husband's favorite foods and to give their bodies over as peace offerings. It is where men learn that it's better to break than to bend, no matter who ends up shattered. In fundamentalist spaces like Stillwater, instead of help, men learn to hide what's broken under the umbrella of their authority because therapy is considered part of the dangerous outside world, like you and the CBC and me. Nothing is more dangerous to a fundamentalist than the outside world. When I was a teenager in the Adventist church, a friend of mine wasn't allowed to job shadow as a journalist because journalists didn't tell the right or the important kinds of truth and so weren't part of the kingdom of God. I myself was encouraged to become a nurse because when the end times came and the persecution of Sabbath keepers like us began, I'd be poised to convert people who were sick and dying and desperate, although I'd have to risk torture and execution by the state to do so. So as you might imagine, these were not happy thoughts for a 16-year-old looking at careers and not really interested in how many jewels might be set in my heavenly crown if I died a most terrible death. As Adventist teenagers in private school, though, we were taught to look at everything and everyone through the lens of our beliefs, and our beliefs were the same as our fears. These fears influenced who we could choose as friends, who we would marry, and where we would eventually decide to work. In church schooling families, friendships that were formed outside were seen primarily as opportunities to convert, and we were trained in how to approach different kinds of people. After all, an atheist wouldn't be swayed by the same arguments as a Baptist or a Muslim or an Anglican or someone who was gay, like Zach, Lizzie's brother, who is the sweetest kid in the world and deserves so much protection. To this day, I am ashamed that I was taught to convert any gay people I might find into the church before letting them know our ultimate intentions for them, because such people would never come to our sanctuary after they found out we intended to break up their families. About 8 minutes ago, when I started speaking, I told you my growing up years were weird. And in the first iteration of this presentation, by weird, I mostly meant to talk to you about Seventh-day Adventist food. And I am speaking mostly about Adventists today because they are the main focus of Stillwater. I can't just speak about food, though, because the practice of isolating ourselves with our church schools and Adventist-run workplaces and communes like Stillwater is a deliberate part of how we were taught to kill our empathy towards our neighbors. And anyone who refused to accept our church's message was no longer our neighbor. Not really. When we killed our empathy, though, we also killed off part of our humanity, which affected everyone around us, and that is worth talking about, too. That loss of our humanity through the destruction of our empathy is an act that sets up entire congregations and communities and sometimes whole countries to turn away from the people next door or down the street, in the next state, or the country that's always been their steady friend. And in doing that, by treating empathy for the outside world as a sin, the human beings inside these churches, and I don't just mean Adventists or Mennonites, are sheltered from the consequences of their faith and their fears, leaving themselves open to become infected with a casual cruelty that masquerades as love, and sometimes doesn't even aspire to do that. Fundamentalists are not supposed to have empathy for their liberal, their gay, and often their immigrant neighbors, because empathy might lead to real relationships, which might lead to acceptance and appreciation, and even dangerous, worldly love. And the fear of that is by far more strange, more weird than some of our god-awful food. But let's take a moment to look at some of that food, because I did promise, and this will come back, and I will come back to some thoughts on this first recipe for natina later on. Now, natina, which is vegan but tastes an awful lot like pork liver pate, appears in the very first chapter of Stillwater. We find it when Lizzie is copying recipes for a home economics class at the same academy I attended in Kelowna, and the recipe goes like this. Into a blender, add tomato juice, potato water, and cornmeal. Add peanut butter and vegetable oil and soy sauce, together with herbs, garlic powder, onion powder, salt, and seasoning salt. Add gluten flour and wheat flour and blend until smooth. Fold in oats and breadcrumbs and pour into empty, greased aluminum cans and bake in a water bath until the mixture is set. Slice and serve in sandwiches and on toast. Good old Natina. Now, if the combination of peanut butter, tomato juice, and potato water doesn't make you want to convert to the Adventist faith, I have more recipes coming up. But we were talking about empathy, which it turns out is not all that easy to kill. And in Stillwater, Lizzie has empathy for Zach and Marie. Zach has empathy for everyone. Marie has empathy for herself. And Daniel scours away at his, not to make it soft or make it disappear, but to make it rough. So when I say I grew up weird, I suppose it's not just about the natina, or the barely edible ribbons of veggie bacon called stripples, or about sweet and sour fry chick. It's also about being taught that empathy could lead us straight outside the doors of the church and its safety into the outside world of dangers, like you and the CBC and me. Growing up and well beyond that, nothing was supposed to be more frightening to us than the outside world. Not even the youth pastors and gym teachers and Bible teachers and school bus drivers and choir directors. All the men and even 2 women who groomed and sexually assaulted children under their authority. We weren't supposed to fear them so long as they repented, so long as the allegations were actually believed. Because if anyone deserved our empathy, we were told, it was those men and the temptations they faced by having girls on their buses and in their classrooms, girls who were beautiful and prone to exaggeration. Those men, but never the women, deserved our empathy and our forgiveness and even our disbelief in their crimes. And then they deserved more access to the same children. Because that, we were told, is what God always called on us to do. Like my Lizzie, I learned in my church that hypocrisy and turning a blind eye to bad men runs deep in these evangelical traditions. And we see now in our American neighbors, with the second election of a racist, rapist, deporter of human beings to concentration camps, that the fruit and the branches and the leaves and the roots of such vines, especially when planted in political power, is strangling and altogether rotten. I'm a little bit reluctant to tell you how long ago it was when I first started writing Stillwater. What I don't mind saying is I thought Stillwater was going to be another short story. After all, I was just about to publish Mennonites Don't Dance with Thistledown Press, and a novel felt like more of a stretch than I was ready for. What I thought was a short story, however, kept wanting to grow. And after having fictionalized my Mennonite experiences in Mennonites Don't Dance, I realized it was time to write about Seventh-day Adventists. And after avoiding it for a decade, I was finally ready. Now, my family and I never lived at a commune like the one in Stillwater, but my fictional commune is loosely based on one that was called Silver Hills, which operated in the North Okanagan Valley of British Columbia, right up until they became famous for their organic sprouted grain bread, which is roughly the texture of loofah and is now ubiquitous in almost every grocery store and Costco in Canada. So if anyone is looking for high fiber bread, bagels, and even biscotti to make sure you're buying Canadian while cleaning out your colon, Silver Hills is the loaf for you. Good old Silver Hills. So I never grew up in a commune, but one day my mother told me a story. She and my dad nearly moved to Silver Hills when my sister was 2 and my mom pregnant with me. And in that story, she described how all of the commune children's eyes were orange from eating too many beets and carrots. So, of course, orange-eyed children were among the first characters I wanted to bring onto the page. For whatever reasons, my own parents decided against the move, and before I was 2 years old myself, they separated for the last time, which was really best for everyone. So when I began to write Stillwater, and once I knew it was going to be a novel and not a short story, I wrote it as sort of a what if. What if my parents had stayed together? And what if I had grown up at Silver Hills? And then, about 2/3 of the way through a first draft that never really felt like it was coming together, that felt like something was missing, something happened that would put Lizzie and Stillwater and me on a shelf for the next 5 years. When I say something happened, a lot of things happened that would go on to reshape Stillwater and take it through various evolutions. But the first domino to fall was my health. And it was the domino that would eventually change the story the most. Back in the first few months of 2012, just more than a year after Mennonites Don't Dance was published, and then shortlisted for the Commonwealth, the Danuta Glebe, and Forest of Reading Awards. I broke my back. Now, broke isn't exactly accurate because that implies a fracture or a spinal cord injury. Instead, after actual decades of undiagnosed adenomyosis, which is the same disease as endometriosis, but on the inside of the uterus, my sacroiliac joints both ruptured from the stress. Essentially, the uterine ligament, which attaches to the inside of the sacrum, twisted that small triangle of a bone in my pelvis like the lid of a jam jar until it became loose and unstable. Now, the SI joints are the ones that indirectly attach our legs to our spines. They are our most load-bearing joints, and living with a rupture there is not unlike driving a car with a broken suspension. I can tell you that the pain was nuclear. But from that day, because I wasn't injured in an accident like Stillwater's car wreck, and because my injury was invisible, it took 2 years. 2 years and high doses of fentanyl and literal daily handfuls of other pain medications, along with 5 or 6 specialists before one finally made a correct diagnosis. This after ruling out an aggressive and debilitating arthritis and advanced bone cancer. Needless to say, I was no longer able to write. I couldn't sit, could barely stand, hardly lift a pen without jarring or twisting my invisibly unstable pelvis. And as time went on, my husband was possibly the only person in the world who continued to insist that I might ever be able to write or think or hope for anything but death ever again. But after those first 2 years and 3 more years of treatments to fuse the torn tissues back together, after a complete hysterectomy and a year of tapering off the extreme narcotics that never really helped with the pain, after ER visits and medical injections that made other patients coming out of their own appointments sob in the elevator, and after $100,000 in physiotherapy bills and lost writing revenue, I found I was once again able to sit at my desk and I was able to use my mind. It turned out that my husband was right. And yet, I needed help to remember who I was as a writer. So I opened up a web page that I'd bookmarked before my injury, and that page took me to a mentorship with one of my favorite writers in the world, Gail Anderson Dargatz, who is now also one of my dearest friends. Over the span of more than a year with Gail, I wrote a second first draft of Stillwater. In my original first draft, Marie died when the family's car spun into the lake, but this time, like me, she survived. And also like me, her injuries resulted in dependence on some of the most addictive and god-awful deadly substances on the planet. Marie alive and Marie addicted. Finally, so much of what had been missing in Stillwater's inception began to take shape. Lizzie and Daniel now had a mutual foil, and Marie herself, a submissive, obedient, sandwich-making wife, was available to represent so much that was going wrong in the world at that exact moment. It was 2017, and for the first time, Donald Trump was elected to the American presidency by white evangelical Christians, exactly like most of the people in this novel and in my life. And right by his side, for a while, was a Seventh-day Adventist doctor, a brilliant pediatric neurosurgeon, Ben Carson, a Black man who stood proudly next to a hate-spewing racist because, I believe, in our church, he was taught to kill his empathy. I cannot speak to racial dynamics, but I can say that Dr. Carson made his career at Loma Linda Hospital in California, the crown jewel in the SDA network of American hospitals. And now, for some reason, he was entering politics instead of continuing to save the lives of desperate children. Dr. Carson had started off running for the Republican ticket himself, but quickly settled for fawning at the feet of America's new ultra bronzed leader. That's where the power was, and that's where he and other evangelical leaders gathered to lay hands on a corrupt, racist, rapist game show host who made fun of disabled people and mocked both injured and captured war heroes. As a Seventh-day Adventist, Dr. Ben Carson was supposed to be the best of us. But now his former colleagues were heard whispering in the hallways of Loma Linda, asking one another whether they had ever really known the man, this savior of children, including cancer patients and conjoined twins, at all. Even now, 8 years later, I don't know how to reconcile Dr. Ben Carson working with a president bent on taking away health care for childhood cancer patients. And while I do understand it intellectually, and understand the lack of love for our neighbors because I lived inside that bitter stew of hypocrisy for years, my God-given bleeding heart may never recover from witnessing the carnage that's the result of white evangelicals, including Mennonites and Adventists, choosing cruelty over kindness for their neighbors. A choice that is once again being played out in the United States and in every sphere of influence that such evil men once again occupy. We have an election in Canada this month, and when I think of the characters in Stillwater, I know how Daniel would vote, and that Marie would vote with him. I told you earlier this was all going to be weird, and now I see that I should also use words like surreal and devastating and heartbreaking, infuriating. But I promised weird, so let's get back to Adventist food for a moment. Now, just quickly, I want to add that weirdness, in my experience as both a writer and a reader, is very good for fiction, because weirdness provides memorable, concrete details that tend to linger in a reader's mind. So when I decided to incorporate foods from Seventh-day Adventist culture and to publish my own family's recipes in the novel itself, I knew I was probably going to scar a few people for life. In fact, a few of you are probably still feeling that from Natina, and if not, just wait. Now, if you've read Stillwater, you'll remember recipes for things like gluten steaks and nut patties and Special K roast, not to mention Mrs. Wroblewski's toasted banana and tomato sandwiches with caramelized Miracle Whip. But as a reminder, here's what goes into making gluten steaks. Add 3 cups of water to 8 cups of organic, unbleached flour. Knead until dough becomes elastic and then form a ball. Place in a large bowl and cover with water and allow to soften overnight. To wash the flour, work the starch out of the dough by kneading it in the bowl of water while making sure to keep the dough together. It will become more elastic as you work. Now, discard the washing liquid, then wash again in fresh water, and then repeat washing and kneading until the water is almost entirely clear. Bring a pot of vegetable stock to a rolling boil, and with clean kitchen scissors, snip steak-sized slices of the gluten meat into the stock. Boil gently for 30 to 35 minutes until the steaks float to the top. Coat in breading and fry in a little oil. Serve with mashed potatoes and well-cooked vegetables. I don't think I can tell you how long it took as a Mennonite child who was raised on farmer sausage and vareniki to learn how to get used to Seventh-day Adventist food. Back in chapter 1 of Stillwater, we encountered that recipe for Natina. With its generous helpings of salt, seasoning salt, and soy sauce, which is also largely salt, Natina may be vegetarian, even vegan, But even with a salad on the side, that kind of salt will still eventually make your heart explode. I told you I'd come back to this recipe, Natina. And that's because the first time I ate Natina, I was a 7-year-old Mennonite girl visiting my Adventist father after a 6-hour Greyhound bus ride from Swift Current, Saskatchewan to Calgary, Alberta. And because of taking the bus, and because of being so far away from my mother, and because of the horrible taste of that Natina sandwich that my dad toasted for me, I locked myself in his bathroom and cried. The second time I was given Natina, I was 14 and so unable to swallow a second bite of what my grandmother instead called peanut butter loaf that I accepted a bowl of chicken noodle soup from her instead. Soup that had been prepared weeks ago for my not vegetarian uncle. Unsurprisingly, after I managed to swallow every single spoonful of that soup, because I couldn't say no a second time to an elder, I spent that entire night where I was visiting my grandparents in their bathroom, trying not to let them hear me throw up. I ate that chicken noodle soup instead of my grandmother's Natina. I ate that meat in that chicken noodle soup, which was not God's plan for my diet, and I got my comeuppance. And yet, however inedible I found Natina to be, it is a beloved Adventist dish and one built on the ideology that if it's vegetarian and made by Seventh-day Adventists, it must be good for you. Or at the very least, it must be better than the evils of meat, which, like other slippery slopes, can lead to the dangers of unclean meat, like pork or shellfish, and from there we might slip straight into the dangers of the outside world, dangers like you and the CBC and me. If you've experienced it, you'll know that inside a fundamentalist church, or many other hierarchies, there is a profound danger of group thinking, which is something we see with Daniel, who takes on the even more strict teachings of Director Schlant and the entire Stillwater community when he moves his family there. It's also something we're seeing with a vast majority of white American evangelicals, and we're seeing it here too in Canada. My sister, born Mennonite like me, baptized Seventh-day Adventist like me, a one-time aspiring artist and women's studies student, an avid reader and a CBC listener and a proud Canadian. Since the first election of the current American president, she has turned, along with a majority of my family, to fundamentalist Baptist theology, with women in complete submission to men, and men like Trump in leadership overall. My sister's political worldview began to warp together with her religious beliefs when she began to read publications like Rebel News and listen to men like Ben Shapiro. So by the time the COVID-19 pandemic made its way here, my sister, like Daniel in Stillwater, shunned COVID vaccines. She protested on behalf of the truckers' convoy alongside the People's Party and Maxime Bernier, and now our relationship, once as close as any sisters could be, lies in tatters between us. 2 years ago, my sister bought a copy of Stillwater, and I haven't heard a word about it since. As I said earlier, Stillwater, the novel, went through several evolutions before it was finally declared complete. That first evolution was Marie's return to life, which allowed me to explore themes of health and addiction and a wariness of modern science and therefore medicine. And I'm using the word evolution deliberately because this isn't about how many drafts or how many layers of revisions and edits this or any other novel has ever put through before going to print. I am using the word evolution because of the several seismic events, each of which changed the environment in which I wrote this book. I used the word dominoes before too, and said that the first to fall was my illness and injury. The second wasn't Donald Trump or COVID-19, but the Pulse nightclub massacre in Florida. The Pulse massacre happened while Donald Trump was still campaigning in 2016, and it felt for a moment as though that country and parts of ours might finally stop and search their individual and collective souls. But as Canada grieved with our neighbors quickly mopped up whatever accidental empathies they may have felt and moved on, and they bought more guns. And yet, for me, that dreadful tragedy broke the spiritual armor that had been constructed around my heart by decades of indoctrination. All my life, that bigotry had twisted against my conscience. And yet, for those bigotries that I tried for so long to accept, I accept full responsibility. That terrible tragedy, that unthinkable evil, that shooting changed the core of who I thought I was supposed to be. And as I continued to write Stillwater, it also necessarily changed the substance of its story. Finally, I began to listen to what Lizzie's brother, Zach, had been trying to tell me. The next domino to fall, and the next evolution of Stillwater, came with the COVID-19 pandemic. At first, while we were all still baking bread and sewing masks and cheering on healthcare workers, I believed that that shared moment in history would reconnect my sister and me. We would work together but apart to keep each other healthy, or so I thought. I love my sister. I love her every bit as much now as I ever have, even as the fault line between us seems to widen by the day. Like I told you earlier, she rejected the COVID vaccines and masks and social distancing, believing these were conspiracies designed by the government to thin our numbers and teach us compliance to our leaders instead of to God. And in Stillwater, Daniel and the others at the commune come to the same conclusions. Stillwater was released in May of 2023. And now, thanks to white American evangelicals, Donald Trump, whose policies resulted in refrigerator trucks parked outside of hospitals to contain the hundreds of thousands of unnecessarily dead, is president again. Canada is being threatened with economic siege. Ukraine and Europe are in their greatest peril since World War II. And when I look away from my own Mennonite turned Adventist turned fundamentalist Baptist family to my husband's, I find third and fourth generation Seventh-day Adventists there, also Canadians, waving Christian nationalist flags. Now, here's the thing to know about Seventh-day Adventists and why their support of a fascist state is so unsupportable. Adventists, like Mennonites, preach a strict separation between church and state, not for the sake of the state, but the church. They do this because they specifically expect to face the persecution and torture and executions that I mentioned earlier, and they expect it to begin at the hands of the United States of America and its president, all for their Sabbath-keeping faith. And they expect that all other people who call themselves Christians but go to church on Sundays and don't like differences will unite with the government to hunt down Adventists and kill them. Adventists are meant to be afraid of American presidents. But instead, in Donald Trump, they see a protector, someone who will shield them from people like you who read, and people like me who write, from gay and trans people and feminists and liberals and anyone with empathy for their neighbors. And for these Adventists, I believe it was Dr. Ben Carson, pediatric neurosurgeon, Adventist hero, who gave them cover to do so. I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, and I grew up Mennonite. And while some parts of my roots are certainly worth keeping, those that needed to be cut off were not so easily overcome. But I think the reason I was finally able to do so is that all my life I read books. I read fiction, not from our traveling Adventist bookstore, but the best of Canadian literature. I read Gail Anderson Dargatz and Miriam Taves. I read Sandra Birdsall and Karen Connolly and Margaret Atwood and Carol Shields and Alice Munro, who is a completely other story now. And in reading them, I was constantly expanding instead of shrinking my empathy, which so many churches desperately fear. Reading is the reason that the bigotries I was taught never rested comfortably inside of me. Lizzie also reads. With her library card, which she wields to gain knowledge, she is exercising her independent will, even if she doesn't know it yet. And like me, reading will save her, because empathy is not dangerous, it is redemptive. And that is exactly the reason that books are being challenged today. It's why my short story collection was banned by the public library system in far north Alberta. It's why fearful parents want to take away opportunities for children and teenagers to learn about others and to curate what the adults in their tightly controlled circles can access as well. That's why, when I was an avid reader of literary fiction as a teenager and young adult, I was reprimanded for not choosing titles from our mobile bookstore or the church library, especially when I dared to share the books I had found with others. Notably, the people who reprimanded me for my reading were the same people who chased me out of the church one Sabbath morning for wearing pants instead of a skirt, and they are the same kinds of people who at Stillwater try to make sure that Lizzie is brought into submission as well, with dresses and textbooks on creationism, because more than just about anything, they fear actual science. In Idaho this year, around the same time that the COVID vaccines were banned there, a district began to require children and teenagers to have parents accompany them to the library. Not because the kids were creating any sort of trouble, but because of a law allowing parents to sue libraries if their children read anything they deem scandalous or improper or dangerous. And Stillwater, for so many reasons, but especially for portraying Zach as a young gay boy, would be among those books being challenged. Just like Mennonites Don't Dance was banned for blasphemy in far north Alberta, which is largely Mennonite country. Throughout this presentation, I've talked about the dominoes that have fallen and the evolutions Stillwater has undergone. And now, with the way things are with our neighbors to the south, the novel is changing shape one more time, this time into a screenplay. Working together with my dear friend Martez Fennick, a Toronto native, novelist, and screenwriter, we asked Stillwater two questions. What if the car accident that happened in the second chapter of the novel happened now instead of a few years ago? And what if the characters were American? So far, we've completed a pilot for what will probably be an 8-part streaming series, for which my literary agents, Rob Firing and Laura Cameron at Transatlantic Agency, are seeking a production company. We have 2 directors, both women, who have asked to come on board, and we are determined to see this story into the hearts of as many people who need to understand its dynamics as possible. People who may look at evangelicalism and not yet understand that the hypocrisy and the lack of empathy for the outside world are features and not bugs. While so much of the streaming series, if it's made, will be the same as the novel, the location and one more important change has been made to fit the time and place. And as we come to the end of this lecture, I'm going to share with you a partial synopsis. See if you can spot the differences. 16-year-old Lizzie is trapped between her passion for science and the conspiracy theories embraced by her Seventh-day Adventist father and Mennonite mother. Even accessing the public library, her refuge, now requires the use of a fake ID, which is easier to obtain than permission from her parents. Following a visit to an SDA commune in the hills of Idaho, Lizzie's father, Daniel, loses control of the family car and spins into a lake. Lizzie saves her mother, Marie, from drowning, but Marie is badly injured with catastrophic fractures to her hands and damage to her internal organs. Marie begins to miscarry a pregnancy she'd been keeping to herself. In the hospital, the surgeons can't operate until Marie is stable, and she cannot become stable until the fetus she's carrying is delivered. An abortion would be best, but the doctors can't perform one, even after the baby's heart stops beating. Lizzie steps in as her mother's advocate, and with the help of an OGBYN who's already seen enough preventable death on her ward, Marie gets the help she needs. The delay, however, means it's too late to restore function to one of Marie's hands. And for Lizzie, it means keeping yet another family secret. And that brings the script up to the end of episode 1. Now, I have to say again that I am truly so grateful to every one of you listening. And if I've offended anyone with what I've said about evangelicalism, about the first and second coming of Trump, I have to say that I'm not sorry. To put it bluntly, I would not disclose the location of Anne Frank, who today is a pregnant child in Idaho, or a terrified immigrant or trans girl in Texas or Georgia, to anyone I went to church with, including my family. I've lost my family in so many ways, an ambiguous loss, as many of you probably have also experienced in these last 8 years, is shattering. Lizzie knows it too. She lives with the loss of her father to his theology and ideology every day, even when he's in the same room. And when Marie is injured, so is their mother-daughter bond, as Lizzie becomes her caretaker and secret keeper, the adult in the relationship. And in Stillwater's final chapters, Lizzie loses the person she loves most in the world too, because of fundamentalist, white evangelical thinking. I know that all of you listening today are readers, and I'm guessing some and perhaps many of you are writers as well. So while I did say that my writing never ends with an altar call, today I am going to ask all of you to continue stretching your empathy by reading more novels like Stillwater. And if you write, here is my own come to Jesus moment. Be morally political in your themes by forcing readers to stretch their empathy, because you never know who's going to pick up your books, and the empathy you help save is needed now more than ever. You might even save a life. You might even help save your country. I'm going to conclude with 2 more recipes. One more from my Seventh-day Adventist recipe box, and one that is Mennonite. Mennonites have gotten off easy in this lecture, but I assure you they are on full display in Mennonites Don't Dance. This is the Seventh-day Adventist recipe for Special K roast. In a large mixing bowl, combine 4 cups of cottage cheese and 1 cup of finely chopped walnuts with 5 eggs, a packet of onion soup mix, a cup of water, and 6 cups of Special K cereal. Transfer to a well-greased baking sheet, baking dish, and bake for an hour until set. Serve with brown beans and tomato sauce, creamed corn, and Lipton noodles and sauce. And now, lastly, this is a sort of poem I wrote about my Mennonite grandmother's roll kuchen. When my Mennonite grandmother was alive, I asked her how to make roll kuchen. "I'll show you," she said, and handed me a chipped enamel bowl and a fork. 3 eggs from an ice cream pail, fresh from Uncle Bill's chickens. Grandma, delighted when I could crack them with just one hand. "Some cream," she said, and gave me a jar from Uncle Harry, so thick I needed a spoon to get it out. Without measuring, Grandma pinched salt and baking soda, placed the fork in my hand, took my hand in hers, and we whisked flour from the 100-pound barrel in the cold room downstairs, a little and then a little more, until the mixture came together. On Grandma's table, I pushed the dough away with the heels of my hands, then with my fingers gathered it back towards me. Just for a minute, while Grandma set a pot of lard onto the back of the stove to melt, then turn hot enough to burn down the house. "Listen," she said, and tipped a spoonful of water into the pot, causing it to hiss and scream, as though the devil himself had been dropped into the fat. We rolled out the dough, cut it into rectangles with a butter knife, cut slits in those, and folded the dough through to make each into a knotted rag. 2 at a time, the roll kuchen fried in the lard, while Grandpa came inside with a watermelon that could never be anything but sweet. Thank you again. Elbows up. Don't forget to vote.